one's GPL source code release from 1999 is probably the best place to start. The actual function we're looking for is called SV_AirAccelerate, which is located within the svuser.c file on line 207. For the sake of readability, I've made some adjustments to it here, but if you want to look at the function in its original 1996 id Software Engineering glory, you can find a link to it down below. SV_AirAccelerate runs once every frame, always ending by updating the player's velocity by adding some vector to it. The obvious question is, what is this vector and how is it calculated? So to figure that out, let's just step through the function line by line. First off, the function takes an input in the form of a vector called wish velocity. This vector is constructed from the direction of your movement keys and the camera rotation, and then scaled up to the max walking speed. It effectively represents the speed and direction that you're telling the character to move in on the global XYZ axes. Now, the first thing the function does with that vector is already kind of obscure, because the vector normalize function actually does two things. The first one we can glance from the name. It takes in a vector, normalizes it so that its length is 1, and spits out the result, right? Well, it would do that if it was well written, because what it actually returns is the length of the vector, for reasons, I'm sure. To be fair, it does actually normalize the vector it's given, it just doesn't return it, but instead modifies it directly. The problem is just that it does a secret second thing without telling you. So what we actually get out of it is the length of wish velocity being passed into the wish speed variable, and then wish velocity itself being scaled down to a length of 1. After this, the wish speed is then immediately clipped to a max value of 30. Next, the current speed is calculated by taking the dot product of the player's current velocity vector and the wish velocity vector. As a quick refresher on what the dot product actually is, if it's been a while since you last needed it, mathematically, taking the dot product between two vectors is defined as multiplying all the matching components and then adding the products together to get a single number. Visually, you can simply imagine it as projecting one of the vectors onto the other, multiplying it by the length of the vector that it was projected onto, and then taking that new length as the result. In our case, since one of the vectors we're dealing with is a unit vector, it actually makes the shape of the dot product a lot simpler. As we rotate the wish velocity, starting from both vectors pointing in the same direction, the result of the dot product starts at the length of the velocity, passes over 0 at 90 degrees, and reaches negative our velocity at 180 degrees. And this is of course mirrored on the other side. Notice that this means that current speed isn't really an accurate variable name. It's not an actual measurement of how fast you're moving, but rather how closely the wish velocity aligns with the actual velocity vector. But I'm sure that discrepancy will not lead to any unintended behavior later. The next step is to take the difference between the wish speed and current speed to find out how much speed needs to be added to the player. If that difference happens to be 0 or less, then we know that no speed needs to be added and we can exit the function early to avoid computing things that don't do anything. Otherwise though, if add speed is greater than 0, we keep going and define the accel speed, which is now the actual speed that's going to be added on each frame. It's set to be equal to add speed, but only up to a certain limit that's calculated right above. This limit is now defined by 3 new variables that we haven't seen before since they're defined outside of the function, but they're actually not too complicated. Grounded wish speed is basically the same as our normal wish speed, but it's not clipped to 30, so it goes all the way up to the running speed of 320. SV_Accelerate is a simple constant with the value 10, and host frame time is a measurement of how long the last frame took to render. Think of it as 1 over the game's frame rate. This whole line effectively acts as an upper acceleration limit that our per frame acceleration is clipped to. You can think of this as the acceleration constant and frame time defining how long it should take to reach the grounded wish speed from 0 velocity, with that time being 1 over the accel constant in seconds. So in this case, 1/10 of a second. Note that we're also dealing with 2 different wish speed variables here, one that's capped to 30 and one that's capped to the max walking speed as if we were on the ground. That's why I've opted to name it grounded wish speed here, since the original names for these two were wish speed and wispd, which is almost as funny as visenwaprint SL from studio.h and Finally, the velocity is updated by scaling the wish velocity unit vector up to the length of accel speed and adding that new vector on top of our velocity. So to quickly recap all of that, because I know that was a lot at once, We take the dot product between our velocity vector and the input direction to get the current speed. We then determine how much acceleration needs to take place by taking the difference between that and the wish speed, capped to 30 units. This difference is then compared against a per-frame acceleration limit, and whichever is smaller is added to our velocity in the direction of our inputs. So great! Now that we know how air acceleration works in an intended context, we really have all the pieces we need to figure out air strafing from here. Let's step into the shoes of an exploit hunter for a bit and think about how we could discover air strafing from the knowledge that we have. A possible approach to finding an exploit would be to look for any spot in the function that seems a little out of place, where what the developer wrote doesn't seem to align exactly with what they actually wanted. Maybe we'd look at the vector normalize function, which says it does one thing, but actually does two things, so it's a little ambiguous what its actual purpose is. But on the other hand, the secret return value is documented as a comment next to it in the header file, which is the first place a developer would have looked to find out more about what a function does. And from looking at how both wish velocity and wish speed are used throughout the rest of the function, there's not really anything unusual there, so it does seem like an intentional thing to maybe save a few lines of code. So what about the incorrectly named current speed, which I've also suspiciously not renamed in my efforts to make the function more readable? Well, we know that air strafing requires a sideways input to work, and you might recall that when walking through all the angles that your wish velocity can have, the dot product, which is what ultimately gets passed to the current speed variable, ends up drawing this cosine shape. Maybe some of the pieces are starting to fall into place, but just to be explicit, the points where this cosine wave crosses 0 exactly match our wish velocity pointing 90 degrees to either side. This is looking a lot more like what we've been looking for, so to be sure, let's run through the function with our input direction at 90 degrees. Of course, our current speed gets assigned a value of 0, but this means that in the next step, to find out the add speed, we subtract nothing, so what's determined as the speed that should be added to the player is exactly equal to wish speed. With the per frame acceleration limit applied, the end result is a vector with a length of 30 units being added to our velocity at a 90-degree angle. This does two things. Most apparently, it changes the direction of the velocity on the next frame, but it also slightly increases its length, which is to say a slight increase in speed. These two things directly correlate with the two main aspects that people are told about when learning how to air strafe. The left and right directional inputs come from a guaranteed speed increase when wish velocity points 90 degrees away from the player velocity, and the constant camera turning is explained by the fact that whenever the velocity gets redirected, we need to readjust the angle of wish velocity to be at 90 degrees again. And the simplest way to do that is by just moving the camera over a bit while still holding down the same movement input. Now that sounds like it would be really precise and difficult, right? And yeah, turning at exactly the right speed so that your input direction is at an exact 90 degrees every frame is very precise and arguably not humanly possible. So the fact that humans have been able to air strafe for many years does imply that there is at least some leniency at play here. What's probably most intuitive is that if your wish velocity points too far forward, the worst that'll happen is that you just don't accelerate. But let's watch the values, and specifically the current speed and add speed, as we approach 90 degrees. See what's happening? Once current speed drops below 30, that's when we start sidestepping the speed cap, and add speed goes above 0, allowing us to continue through the rest of the function. From here, the speed gain gradually increases until we hit a maximum at 90 degrees.
No.
What we're effectively simulating here is a slower than optimal turn rate, but thanks to the leniency brought about by the 30-unit threshold, we can still accelerate even if we don't hit exactly 90 degrees. This leniency also applies in the other direction for angles bigger than 90 degrees, but it's also a lot more punishing if you end up overstrafing too much. See, while understrafing, or turning too slowly, simply results in much less speed gain, overstrafing can lead to active speed loss if your wish velocity falls outside of that leniency range. Because now, not only does the impulse generated by the function start pointing back on your velocity, but because current speed actually starts dipping into the negative, it results in a much bigger add speed, magnifying the effect even further. Hi, quick little side note, the actual optimal angle is actually frame rate dependent. Kind of. More specifically, it comes about from this initial calculation of accel speed. These two are effectively constant, so the frame time is the only thing that can change. If we run the numbers on this, then we'll find that at 106 FPS or above, the optimal angle actually starts to point slightly in front of 90 degrees on both sides, so like that. But for the sake of simplicity, I've been and will keep assuming a frame rate of 60 FPS. So then, how much speed does good air strafing actually gain? Well, it depends. The size of the vector that gets added to our velocity may be a constant 30, but that doesn't mean that we gain 30 units of speed every frame. The actual speed gain we can figure out with a little bit of Pythagoras and then taking the difference between the previous frame and the current frame. But that also only gives us the speed gain for that specific velocity. If we start to increase that starting velocity, you can see that the sideways vector becomes much less significant at higher velocities, meaning that not only is the angle change smaller, but also the overall speed gain as well. This is why you have to turn your camera more slowly as you gain speed, and it also becomes harder in general to gain speed as you go faster and faster. And at some point, the ground friction you experience every time you land starts to cancel out the speed you gain from air strafing. And there you go. That's the source code behind air strafing as it works in Quake 1, and by extension, pretty much every Source Engine game. See, the reason we're even talking about air strafing today is because the responsible function has been left pretty much unchanged throughout the entire history of the Source Engine. And even though there have been a lot of efforts by Valve to fix the unbounded speed gain, air strafing and the raw acceleration it brings still exists in pretty much every game on this branch of the engine. At least where you have the ability to jump. The simplest way Valve attempted to fix bunny hopping was by simply scaling down the velocity vector to a certain max speed whenever the player lands. This approach is what you can primarily find in Valve's multiplayer IPs, specifically Counter-Strike and Team Fortress. We can even find the exact implementation of this in a function called prevent bunny jumping. There are, however, two particularly interesting approaches that are found in some other games that have some wacky side effects. In Half-Life 2, Valve had a similar implementation, but with one key difference. Instead of directly scaling down the velocity by multiplying it by some value between 0 and 1, they simply add an impulse pointed directly backwards relative to your look direction. Sounds reasonable enough at first, but what they didn't account for is that on a personal computer device, you have a peripheral device called the mouse, which you can use to control the view direction of your in-game avatar. So depending on which way you're looking, you can manipulate that impulse to point in whatever direction you want. Most obviously, turning around 180 degrees will point it directly forward. And since that impulse gets bigger and bigger the higher your velocity is, the speed gain keeps increasing exponentially. This technique is called accelerated backhopping, or ABH, and it's probably the most iconic tech in Half-Life 2 speedrunning. To just reiterate why this works, we know from the Quake source code that the look direction doesn't really matter. All that matters is the angle between your overall input direction on the global XYZ axes and your current velocity. On a mouse and keyboard, this means that you can look in 8 different directions, and as long as you adjust your keyboard inputs accordingly, the math works out exactly the same. So in the case of Half-Life 2, to bunny hop backwards, all you have to do is switch around your strafe keys, holding left when you want to turn right, and holding right when you want to turn left. There are also a few other techniques like a SH and a FH, which trick the game in various ways into thinking you're going in a different direction than you really are. This same implementation is also present in Portal. It's just less prevalent in speedruns due to the smaller, more convoluted levels and, shocker, the ability to teleport from point A to point B. Portal 2, on the other hand, is a really unique case, because here Valve decided to straight up turn off your air control once your velocity goes over 300 units. The way it's implemented, though, is a little weird. Instead of fully turning off air control, it locks your wish velocity so it's only allowed to be in certain quadrants of the global X and Y axes. Yeah, I said this was gonna be weird, just bear with me for a second. Effectively, once your velocity goes over 300, the game looks at the X and Y components of that velocity and checks if either of those is greater than 150 units. For whichever component that is true, it locks the two quadrants on the opposite side so that your wish velocity can no longer point in the direction of either of those quadrants.
I'm
The
building
way it goes
the
about
floor of
locking off
MegaBase.
these quadrants is by simply taking the X and or Y components of your wish velocity and just setting their values to 0 if they happen to be in those quadrants, effectively squishing down or projecting your wish velocity onto one of the axes. This has the weird side effect that, as long as you're roughly aligned with one of the global axes, you can still strafe a little bit, but not make any proper turns. Once your wish velocity angle changes enough, the locked quadrants disallow you from continuing the strafe in the same direction. Your wish velocity simply doesn't go any further even if you're holding the correct buttons and turning the camera. But strafing in the other direction is now possible again, because the wish velocity angle for that is now in a quadrant that's allowed. If you're moving in a direction that's not aligned with the global axes, however, like diagonally, you're extra boned, because now both your X and Y components are over 150. The X component locks off these two quadrants, and the Y component locks off these two. So no matter what direction you hold, you're completely locked out of air strafing. Some of the lesser known about Source Engine descendants are Respawn Entertainment's Titanfall games, which also include air strafing. The main difference here is that the rate at which you can turn with your strafes is much lower than in every other game up until this point. This is thanks to the SV air accelerate constant, which mirrors the SV accelerate constant from the Quake source code. If we think back again, this line just defined an upper acceleration limit that the actual acceleration on any given frame would be capped to. In practice, that means that if the accelerate, or in this case air accelerate value, is much lower, the vector added to our velocity each frame becomes smaller, and the optimal turn rate slows down with it. What Titanfall builds on top of that is a mechanic speedrunners call strafe lurch, which is something I've already covered in depth in a different video. This is a small, immediate impulse that both redirects your velocity and also results in a bit of speed loss anytime a movement key is pressed within 0.4 seconds after jumping. This can be used to trade in speed to momentarily make a sharper turn by tapping a movement key multiple times, which is aptly called tap strafing. With Apex Legends, Respawn decided to limit bunny hopping similarly to how it was done in the Counter-Strike series by simply reducing the overall speed every time you touch the ground. The slowdown here is a lot more gradual than in Counter-Strike and Team Fortress though. Instead of scaling your velocity down to a certain speed immediately, it seems to happen over a handful of hops. Oh, also this game lets you bind the scroll wheel to movement inputs, so tap strafing looks like this now. Excluding Half-Life Alyx, which for obvious reasons has a very different movement system, that leaves us at the most recent standalone Source Engine game. So we're done, right? Who put that there? That was not there before. What even is on this? Oh, right. Because there's a different game company that also made, you may have heard of id Software, but it says Quake on here. I forgot about Quake. Given that this video was initially about Quake and how it brought about air strafing, it would be a bit silly of me not to talk about the other Quake games that followed. Turns out, id Software also wasn't the biggest fan of players abusing the movement system to jump around corners and continuously gain speed. So they too went about fixing it, but their approach was a little bit different. Their main beef was actually with the air control rather than the unbounded speed gain, so when Quake 2 came around, they simply reduced the acceleration factor from 10 to 1 to limit how big the accel speed could get, reducing the size of the vector that would be added to your velocity on each frame. Now that sounds very similar to what Respawn did for Titanfall, but if we compare the functions from Quake 1 and 2 side by side, we can also see that the snippet responsible for clipping the wish speed is straight up missing in Quake 2. This would normally mean that by holding sideways, every frame we would get a vector with the length of the max running speed, in Quake 2 that's 300, added to our velocity. But since the add speed is now always clipped to our now much smaller accel speed, we never end up benefiting from that much larger add speed. Or do we? Taking another look at the dot product, what it effectively returns is a sliding scale between the length of a velocity vector when Wishdure points directly forward, and 0 when Wishdure points 90 degrees to the side. After subtracting that from the wish speed, any value above 5, assuming a frame rate of 60 FPS, gets clipped to that number. Only once Wishdure is pointed forward enough so that the dot product is 5 less than the wish speed, does the final accel speed get smaller. Anywhere else, it's stuck to that value. So, when the size of our accel vector is capped, the best thing we can do with it is point it as far forward as possible to maximize our speed on the next frame. If this sounds familiar to you, that's because this is the exact same phenomenon that I briefly mentioned earlier talking about Quake 1. It's just much more pronounced here because the acceleration constant significantly lowers whatever value this expression spits out. Now, the fact that the optimal input angle points farther forward means that to get the best possible acceleration, we need to adjust our inputs and camera angles not only to get our Wishdure as close to that point as possible, but also to find the equivalent mirrored point on the other side whenever we switch strafe directions. Because the required angle change isn't a simple 180-degree flip anymore. To achieve this, some very clever Quake gamers have devised a couple of different techniques with names like half-beat, full-beat, and dual-beat strafe jumping, which are all different styles and flavors of combining look direction and movement inputs to switch strafe directions in ways that are either beneficial for awareness, speed gain, or are just generally more comfy for some people. Another interesting thing about the optimal strafe angles is that they're actually constantly moving. As you gain speed, the optimal angles start out by pointing very far forward and gradually move towards 90 degrees on either side as the difference between your velocity and wish speed increases. This is another one of those weird side effects that comes about due to the function's use of
I got my connection.
If our current velocity is significantly bigger than the wish speed, it creates a range of angles around our velocity vector where our accel speed gets clamped to 0 because of this difference. So we can rotate the Wishdor vector a few degrees to either side, and as long as current speed is bigger than wish speed, the acceleration is stuck to 0. The bigger that difference between our velocity and wish speed is, the more we have to rotate Wishdor until the dot product becomes small enough to where it passes the point of being smaller than wish speed, and we can get some acceleration again. A nice way to visualize this, I find, is by imagining a copy of the velocity vector and rotating it until it passes a line that's at the height of wish speed. So as we increase the size of our velocity and thereby the copy that we're rotating, you can see that it takes more rotation to pass that line, and that the line itself in relation appears to approach 0, meaning that the necessary rotation approaches 90 degrees. Okay, quick little breather. Now, if none of that made sense to you and you're completely lost, honestly, that's totally fine, because this is a very hard thing to try and understand within the span of like 20 minutes. In fact, it took me like 5 days of just reading the source code for me to like wrap my head around it in a way that I can semi-coherently explain. In fact, throughout the process of writing this video, I literally forgot how it works like 15 times, and every time I had to read through the source code again and be like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that's how it works. Okay, got it. I remember now, and then I would forget like 5 minutes later. But if there is one thing that I want you to think about right now, it's just how wild this really is. Because quite literally, all the developers did was change one value from 10 to 1 and deleted a short snippet from the function, and what we got out of it was a completely new set of tech for air strafing, with its own set of nuances that both look and feel completely different from Quake 1 and Source-style strafing. Like, under the hood, it's still kind of doing the same thing, but execution-wise, it's completely different. Like, isn't that cool? I don't know, man, I think it's cool. Throughout the rest of the Quake series, this is pretty much how air strafing works with no major changes made in later installments. Quake 3 Arena would turn out to be a very important release in the series, as its engine is the one that would end up being used in a lot of recognizable series both in and outside of idsoft. Doom 3, for example, made the switch to the Quake 3 engine, and everything you would expect about air strafing carries over. That is, of course, until it was fully reworked again in Doom 2016. The ability to accelerate in the air was completely removed, but what they brought back was, ironically, ridiculous amounts of air control, which is funnily exactly what Carmack didn't want back in the day, but it kind of perfectly aligns with the design philosophy that the modern Doom games are built on. Visually, air strafing in Doom 16 and Eternal looks very similar to Source Engine style, but mechanically it works very differently. Air movement in those games was fully rebuilt to be a lot more intuitive and allow you to actually move in the direction of the keys that you're pressing, which is something that every previous version of the engine, including Source, did not allow you to do. As a result, air strafing in Modern Doom is a lot simpler execution-wise, only requiring you to hold forward while turning the camera to change your direction. And while we don't have direct access to the source code of the Modern Doom games, we can make a pretty good guess at one possible way that they could have reworked air movement.
I'm just gonna go to
one secret I've kept from you is that while Quake 3 didn't change the actual implementation of air strafing from Quake 2, they did add an alternative version of the function that they simply never used. It even has a developer comment at the top saying that this alternative version should fix the unbounded speed gain from air strafing, but feels bad during gameplay somehow. My current theory, and I can't prove this without reverse engineering the game and breaking the sacred end-user license agreement, which I have definitely read, is that Doom 16 and Eternal both use a modified version of this unused Quake 3 function. So how does this thing actually work? At a glance, we can already see that structurally it looks very different from the original air accel function, and it's luckily a lot simpler too. Instead of trying to figure out a veer amount by taking a dot product, this implementation simply subtracts the velocity vector from the wish velocity vector, which gives you a new vector that can be drawn as pointing from the tip of velocity to wish velocity. This then just gets clipped to the per frame acceleration limit and is then added to the velocity. So that sounds reasonable, so what's the problem then? Why did the devs say this feels bad? I think the problem is not at all obvious, but I believe it's the fact that no matter how fast you're going or what direction you're holding, this function always works to get your speed to exactly whatever wish speed is. If you're moving above that speed for any reason, it will always slow you down to match that speed, so no momentum preservation at all. Imagine you get launched by a grenade or rocket, and instead of moving through the air at a constant speed, you instantly slow down to your walking speed midair. Worse still, if you're holding no direction, the function will try to slow you down to 0, since that's what your wish speed is when your input is neutral. The key thing that connects this to how air movement works in modern Doom is in how you hold a certain direction, and your character will just start moving in that direction. The spot where the newer Dooms differ is that you can fully preserve your speed as long as you don't turn too quickly. So if this function is what Doom 16 and Eternal ended up iterating on, what did they change?
My water bottle.
My personal guess is that they simply scale the wish velocity vector up to the length of the player's velocity once that goes above the wish speed constant. This removes the problem of slowing down even when you're holding forward or just changing your direction a tiny bit. It doesn't cancel all speed loss, however. If the change in direction is large enough so that the move from velocity to wish velocity cannot happen in a single frame, you will always lose speed due to the fact that the function tries to get to your wish velocity in a straight line rather than along a circle that would preserve the velocity's length. The only case where there is no speed loss would be if the push vector can get your velocity straight over to wish velocity in one frame. This at least tracks with the behavior that Doom Eternal has, where there is a threshold to the turn speed, where if you turn faster than that threshold, you will lose some speed proportionally to how fast you are turning. But turning below that threshold results in no speed loss at all. Though again, this is just a guess at how they could have done it. The last game from id that had its source code released was Doom 3, so that's as close as we're gonna get in terms of hard proof of anything. Hello, I would now like to talk to you about the Call of Duty series. Listen, when I started working on this video like 2 years ago, I had not played a single Call of Duty game. So when I realized that Infinity Ward licensed the Quake 3 engine to make the first Call of Duty, and then they just kept using that same engine after that, I knew I had to do the only thing a reasonable person would do, which is to play every single one of them so I can tell you how air strafing works in them. And I'm going to do that while attempting to map out a timeline on my dad's old whiteboard, because Call of Duty's development cycle as an annual franchise can get a little confusing at times. Starting with the first COD, this baby basically runs on the original Quake 3 engine, so air strafing works pretty much exactly as you'd expect. Well, almost. Basic air strafing does work the same as in Quake 3, but the two main differences are that 1, the overall walking speed is much smaller than in Quake 3.
Slip,
it's 190 as opposed to Quake 300. And 2, this game has a very harsh instant speed reduction every time you land, which limits how much speed you can build up, even if your jump inputs are frame perfect.
So my
On paper, this is pretty much exactly like the prevent bunny jumping function from Counter-Strike and Team Fortress, but the way it affects strafing is actually very different. Because we're dealing with Quake 3 style and not Quake 1 style strafing here, the optimal Wister angle depends on how fast you're going. The slower you are, the farther forward the optimal angle points, and the landing speed reduction does a pretty good job of keeping you from going too fast. So because of all this, the optimal strafe angle is almost always hanging around like 40-ish degrees. So strafing in COD 1 looks very much unlike what you would expect from a Quake 3 engine game. Infinity Ward would humbly name this engine with their own initials and keep using that engine for every game in the series, while also developing the engine itself. Call of Duty 2 doesn't do a whole lot differently from 1. The biggest difference is that this game actually lets you bind jump to the scroll wheel, which at least makes maintaining your speed over long stretches more feasible, though the landing speed reduction is still very much present. Call of Duty 3 is the first COD game not made by Infinity Ward, but by Treyarch, interestingly with their own supposed in-house engine named NGL. Though even this engine seems to be based on Quake, as strafe jumping works the same as in the previous 2 games. Unfortunately, this is one of the few games that I couldn't get my hands on because it's a console exclusive and I don't have one of those old consoles and I didn't really want to buy one. I spent enough money on the games themselves as is. Now, if you've ever seen a COD speedrun, the Modern Warfare series is where things will start to look a lot more familiar. This is mainly thanks to the introduction of sprinting, which drastically affects what optimal strafing looks like. Like every previous entry, the walking speed and therefore the wish speed while you're in the air is at 190 units. Sprinting raises the grounded running speed up to 285, but it does not touch the airborne wish speed. So even just a regular sprint jump leaves
Okay,
us at a
let me
pretty sizable difference between the two, meaning that the optimal strafe angles will be pointed much closer to 90 degrees in comparison to the previous games. Immediately after the first Modern Warfare came World at War, which is the second title primarily developed by Treyarch, though this time with a fork of the IW3 engine instead of a continuation of their own in-house engine. The most notable difference to Modern Warfare is that Treyarch introduced a stamina mechanic, which limits how long you can sprint for, and by extension, how many truly effective strafe jumps you can do in sequence before you need to slow down and recover that stamina. While Treyarch was working on World at War, Infinity Ward was continuing the Modern Warfare series with their own version of the engine, so they don't include this implementation of the stamina mechanic, and thus feel pretty much identical to the first one in terms of movement. After Modern Warfare 2, Treyarch came out with the first Black Ops, and after 3 came Black Ops 2, both of which are almost identical to World at War in terms of movement. We can start to see a little bit of a pattern where movement in Infinity Ward games is a lot more about perfecting every individual strafe jump, and movement in Treyarch games is a lot more about stamina management and getting the most out of your more limited strafe jumps with clever routing. Wait, never mind, they made ghosts. Infinity Ward games have stamina now, so that's going to make this whole thing a lot more confusing. It's at this point where it becomes a lot more difficult to try and get a picture of what the engine's codebases actually look like, because the best sources we have are the games themselves, and journalistic interviews where a higher-up says, yeah, this next engine is the biggest technical leap ever. We basically rewrote the whole thing from scratch. Like, this next game is going to have so much graphics. In comes a new studio with the name of Sledgehammer Games, tasked with making the biggest banger of a speed game they could possibly conceive of. Advanced Warfare might not be the most beloved game in the series as a whole, but as a speedrun it actually goes unreasonably hard, because this game, by some Christmas miracle, does not have the landing speed reduction that every game before it did. This is, in my opinion, fucking sick, and the closest any game in the series has gotten to what Quake 3 movement actually feels like. Like, not even Call of Duty 1, which is technically way closer to Quake 3 in every conceivable way. This game does have a limited stamina mechanic, but in practice in the speedrun this ends up being much less of a hindrance when you don't actually need to sprint to maintain your speed. Like, you can just keep jumping. Apparently Treyarch and Infinity Ward also had a similar mission statement, because with Black Ops 3 and Infinite Warfare, they immediately followed up with their own takes on futuristic FPS with the typically associated movement abilities like wall running and really anything to do with jetpacks. Unfortunately, both of them kind of suck, in the sense that while they have all this neat, what I'll call game designer movement, the moment you go back to touching the ground, you're playing COD 4 again because of the landing speed reduction, and it's just so tragic. Like, these could be such banger speed games. Movement-wise, the Modern Warfare Remaster only really differs from the original in that it does not feature infinite stamina, but in practice, it actually regenerates so fast that it doesn't even matter. Built on the Sledgehammer engine, COD WoW's movement is like if you took Call of Duty 1 and you made it good. It's good this time. Like, you made it's good and it feels good and it's fun and it's awesome. I will forever cherish Sledgehammer Games and these two titles that they brought to the series, because they're like the only good ones. Like, these two are the only ones where the ground isn't made of Minecraft honey blocks and it actually feels like Quake. I know every COD runner is gonna yell at me for saying that, but I don't care. I will die on this hill. These are the only two good Call of Duty games. So Black Ops 4 is actually really interesting because it has nothing for a speedrunning context. It doesn't have a campaign. It doesn't even have a speedrun.com page. So I got nothing for you. The 2019 reboot of Modern Warfare marks a point in the timeline where airstrafing becomes less and less relevant in the campaign speedruns. I did a bit of testing in this game specifically, and while airstrafing definitely exists and continues to exist in the games after this, the actual air control and air acceleration seems to be much lower, making it only really viable in a few spots in the whole run. The following Modern Warfare titles, Black Ops Cold War, Black Ops 6, and Vanguard, all use this engine and its continuations, so there's not really a whole lot of interesting differences to point out anymore. However, the last standout I'll quickly mention is the Modern Warfare 2 remaster, developed primarily by Beanox using the Sledgehammer engine. Though unfortunately this one differs from the other two Sledgehammer games in that the movement is very faithful to the original, aka the landing speed reduction is back. But now that we've arrived at the end of this branch, how about we take a step back and just see what we've covered. So this is every Quake engine game, at least that I know of, but I guarantee you there's like 50 more that I missed. And this graph doesn't even include source ports, which would triple the size of this monstrosity. So what was that, 36 minutes? And we had a good look at the Quake and Doom series, a handful of Source Engine games, quickly visited Titanfall and got a quick overview of the Call of Duty series. And the amount of stuff I haven't touched on is still, well, you can see it. My point is, there's still so much more to explore here, but I had to put the cutoff point somewhere for the sake of my own and, frankly, your sanity too.
Wait, so you actually spent hundreds of dollars to buy every single Call of Duty game for this?
It was a business expense.
It's safe to say that those of us alive and above the mental capacity of an 8-year-old in the 90s, so not these guys, witnessed something special. Never again will people absolutely flock en masse and lose their absolute shit just to get hold of an operating system. I mean, can you imagine that happening with Windows 11? No, instead we just have millions of people rapidly declining the upgrade whenever Microsoft tries to force it upon us. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring. So why was Windows 95 such a big deal? Why was it the iPhone launch of its time? Well, to understand this, we first have to understand what came before, starting with DOS, 86 DOS. In April 1980, 24-year-old Tim Patterson started developing an operating system he called QDOS, standing for Quick and Dirty Operating System. His company, Seattle Computer Products, was one of the first to begin manufacturing computer systems based around the new 16-bit Intel 8086 processor, but needed a functioning operating system to sell their products. At the time, Digital Research were producing the industry standard OS, but CP/M was designed for 8-bit systems, and they were dragging their heels porting it across to the 8086, a somewhat costly mistake. By December 1980, QDOS had been renamed to 86 DOS, and Seattle Computer Products were able to sell it for $95 to owners of their hardware or prospective buyers. At around the same time, IBM were developing a new Intel 8088 personal computer, and were also on the hunt for an operating system. They also turned to Digital Research, but Digital Research declined IBM's proposal of $250,000 in exchange for unlimited distribution, instead wanting a royalty-based model. IBM then went to Bill Gates, head of Microsoft, who had worked with Seattle Computer Products in the past, creating Microsoft Basic for their systems. In a somewhat sneaky deal, Gates went back to SCP to negotiate and purchase 86 DOS for $50,000, which after a few modifications was then licensed to IBM for use on their new personal computer. This became PC-DOS 1.0 and shipped as standard with every IBM PC, with Microsoft still retaining the rights to sell it themselves under the MS-DOS brand as they saw fit. Now, IBM's strategy of using off-the-shelf parts for their PC meant that the industry around their hardware grew rapidly, as did the uptake, which meant that those of us wanting or needing to use a computer would likely have to embrace this once called quick and dirty operating system, and therefore its command line driven interface. This is pretty much all you get when you turn on a PC running DOS, a drive label and a flashing prompt. Okay, good luck with that. From this point on, intuitiveness goes out of the window. It was up to you to learn and understand exactly how to navigate your system, how to start programs, how to configure your memory, how to edit files, how to copy files, how to change your system configuration, all using text-based commands. Now, this wasn't necessarily something new. After all, most computers of that era would throw you straight into a similar situation upon boot. But for those of us who weren't hobbyists or enthusiasts, perhaps someone just using a computer for their job, this wasn't the most user-friendly situation. This was something that a little company called Apple had the foresight to understand. Steve Jobs had many talents, but he was particularly good at turning something created by and for tech heads into something that the masses could not only use, but actually want to use.
The Mac team's vision was an inexpensive computer as powerful and sophisticated as IBM's PC. with an added
behave
playfulness
like
that would make it
Bedrock.
attractive to young people like
Oh
themselves.
my...
And they wanted it easy to use.
Wait a minute. I need to turn the volume down. I think the video is too... It's muffled. Oh. I think it's because my Steam Deck is on fire right now. But that's fine. I think. Maybe. So, now that it's quieted down, yes, this is Java, but I'm not using controller and mouse controller. I'm using keyboard and mouse. And there's a mod called Midnight Controls, which adds controls support to Java. And you can see all of the Bedrock UI stuffs. It's a mod called Bedrockify, and it makes basically Java behave like Bedrock, so I can build in front of me like this. And it makes it way easier than manually like bridging and stuff. I can speed bridge, so I need to like shift and stuff, you know. I should turn on Minecraft sounds. Why haven't I turned it off? On. Off. Let's do 25%. Oh wait. It has been paused this whole time. Oh no. Bro, I hate myself. I was so close. Oh, we need to go, okay? Well, bye, I guess.
With Macintosh, there are no complicated commands to be memorized and typed into the machine. All you do is move an arrow with a selection device called a mouse and point to what you want from a menu of options presented on the screen.
Now, this is an Apple Mac, first released in 1984 and described as revolutionary by the New York Times, and for good reason. Rather than being a bulky system of components that would boot into a virtual abyss, the Macintosh would take users straight into an intuitive graphical user interface controlled by a mouse, featuring a single button which was quicker to pick up than your mum on Burns night. But this wasn't even the first machine with a GUI. It wasn't even the first Apple machine with a GUI. That machine was the Apple Lisa, launched in January 1983 with the graphical desktop idea actually nabbed from the Xerox Alto workstation that Jobs had seen during the 1979 visit to Xerox Park. Regardless of its origin, the world of computing now had two distinct paths. One, the clunkier but popular IBM PC, the other, the smooth and finessed world of graphical user interfaces, spearheaded by Apple, but quickly followed by the likes of the Atari ST and the Amiga. Of course, the IBM PC wasn't going to be left in the literal dark. In fact, various developers had created GUIs to run on it, including Digital Research themselves, who launched their Gem desktop environment in February 1985. This allowed users to plug a mouse into their PC's serial port and navigate their files using the same point-and-click action that Mac users were already basking in. By this point, Microsoft had licensed their operating system to hundreds of other companies, and with hardware manufacturers creating clones of the IBM PC hardware, it had quickly overtaken IBM's PC-DOS as the de facto operating system, although they were both completely compatible. In April 1985, MS-DOS 3.0 was launched, which significantly improved on previous versions, allowing, among other things, support for networks and higher density floppy disks. But Microsoft weren't blind to the world around them and had realized they needed to jump on the graphical user interface bandwagon as well, which they would do so with the launch of Microsoft Windows in November 1985, which was developed by a team led by Scott A. McGregor, the man behind Xerox PARC's original windowing system.
How much do you think this advanced operating environment is worth? Wait just 1 minute before you answer. Watch as Windows integrates Lotus 123 with Miami Vice. Now we can take this Ferrari and paste it right into Windows Right. Now how much do you think Microsoft Windows is worth? Don't answer. Wait until you see Windows Right and Windows Paint, and then listen to what else you get at no extra charge.
I'm gonna fill up my water bottle. So you need to wait. I'm just gonna show you this. Okay, I am back. So,
MS-DOS
Yes.
executive, an appointment calendar, a card file, a notepad, a clock, a control panel, a terminal, a print spooler, RAM driver, and can you believe it? Reversi! That's right! All these features in Reversi, all for just, how much did you guess? 500? 1,000?
Okay.
Even more? No, it's just $99. That's right. It's $99. It's an incredible value, but it's true. It's Windows from Microsoft. Order today.
Now, Windows 1 is a far cry from what we have today. Windows couldn't be overlapped,
So we have
and even
this.
compared to Mac OS, it
Damn.
was like a toddler's fever
so much
dream.
progress that we
But for a
made
lot
today.
of users, it changed
So
how
first
they
let's
interacted
add
with their
element
computer.
and time
Thanks to
lapse.
the inroads
We're gonna do a
Microsoft had
keyframe
already made
here
with the
and then a
original
keyframe
equipment
here.
manufacturers and businesses alike,
And this recruiting
Windows
is
could be
only
distributed
happening
to
now.
more
We're
users and make
damn.
more of an impact
So
than
go
other
here,
IBM PC
add a
compatible
keyframe,
GUIs
and we're
had
gonna
done
do,
so
I don't
far.
know,
And despite that,
one.
it didn't sell
50,
tremendously well though.
250,
In
200,
December
I guess.
1987, Windows 2 was released, allowing
Yeah,
access
3
to
minutes
expanded memory,
20,
and
that's
shortly after,
kind of
introducing
okay.
a
I'm
protected
just gonna
mode kernel, the ability to run
200,
MS-DOS
let's
programs in
do
tandem under
175.
virtual x86 mode, and the
Yeah,
welcome addition of
255.
preemptive multitasking. However, it was
Then
Windows
let's
3,
add
released in
Elements
1990, where the
camera.
software really began to shine.
But it is all
Up
a
until this
Minecraft
point,
mod.
most programs were still written for DOS.
That's crazy.
Sure, Windows was a nice to have, and it allowed you to keep everything organized and accessible and usable.
Add.
But with computing power
oh.
being somewhat limited, the
What did I
additional
say?
overheads
I think
created
it
by the
didn't
graphical
save
user
this
interface
chunk.
meant that DOS programs were faster,
Yeah, I think this
used less
chunk wasn't
memory,
loaded.
and just generally
Like
were more
it's
compatible,
fine.
given that other users
I
didn't
never
always
got
have
here.
a copy of Windows to open
So
files
yeah,
with.
that's fine.
It was also far more common for developers to create DOS software than
yeah, but
Windows
the
compatible
those chunks
software,
are
given that
well,
almost every
well
PC owner
farther
had DOS,
than.
but only a subset had Windows.
I guess these chunks just.
What everyone
And
does have
say-
though is the internet,
and look at this-
you should get on board with
this
it
thing.
with sponsor Squarespace, especially
I'm
if
the
you want
last
a nice
save the
website.
block.
You can pick from so many styles and
Just
use
a
Blueprint
lonely
AI to get
thing.
the best layout and style options.
Well, I guess
Along with
let's
optimized
start
SEO
making
tools so that
this.
you can show up in Google for the keywords that matter. It's just easy to
Also,
snap
we're at
features
the
in
end.
and
Let's go
out,
to the
even easier than
beginning.
Windows 95 plug and play. But one of my favorite abilities is to swap between mobile and desktop views so that you can optimize your content for every device and make sure it looks
Okay,
great.
so let's
Just head to Squarespace for a
just
free trial,
do
and when you're
this.
ready, go to
Like
squarespace.com/nostalgianerd to save 10% off your
Let's put
first
a key-
purchase of a
wait,
website or
wait.
domain.
Rule of thirds, because that helps me do portrait better, because I'm doing this on TikTok.
Are running at once. My report right now is scattered all over my disk. Whoa, Windows will pull these parts together real quick.
But by 1990, computers were getting faster.
Okay,
Not only
Th-
had the
this is
286
good.
processor been out for
So we're
several
gonna
years, but many
add
users
key
now
frame.
have a 386, offering
and
significant
then
power over previous
let's just
systems.
let it play.
Windows 3 then would play into this, offering virtual memory, which allowed the system to use hard drive space effectively as working memory. Windows 3 also looked a hell of a lot better than previous versions, making use of that sexy VGA mode. With Windows 3, Microsoft also started dabbling in large-scale launch events.
Today we're introducing Microsoft Windows version 3. Our vision is that there will be a personal computer on every desktop, and it will be the key tool for the information age.
Hosted at the New York City Center Theater with 6,000 attendees, it was also broadcast across North America in various Microsoft social fairs. Spending $3 million on these events, Bill Gates labeled it the most extravagant, extensive, and expensive software introduction ever. The idea with Windows 3 was to make it more appealing to the public, given that previous versions were seen more as a business tool, and the plan actually started to work, with more OEM manufacturers including the operating system
Yeah,
out
so
of
this
the
is
box.
10 minutes of progress
This
right
then was
now,
the
as
first
you can see
version of Windows
timeline
to
in 10
achieve
minutes.
commercial success outside of Microsoft's traditional supply routes, and this demand led to a slew of programs being developed to run inside the Windows framework. It also shook up Microsoft's direction and future marketing plans, which would be key. However, regardless of which version you had, DOS was always the master here. Your PC always had to boot to DOS. After all, it ran on DOS. This wasn't Windows' fault, it was just the world it was born into. Windows was simply a program that you called from DOS. It was a shell that ran on top, and that's all it could ever be. Sure, it had some
let's
fancy
put a keyframe
schmancy
here.
features, but it was ultimately just a DOS program that
Let's
made your
see,
life
where
a
am I
little
going?
easier, which not only meant that it was limited by the constraints
yeah.
of DOS, but also, if you wanted to run anything resource intensive, then quitting to DOS was really the only way to go, given the extra layers of abstraction
Yeah, so
Windows
we're gonna
added
go
between
here,
the program and the system
let's
hardware.
put
The
it,
overheads for your average PC at the time
I
were just
guess,
too great
here.
for that. And that's even before tackling the frequent resource and application errors that Windows would throw.
We're introducing something new. It's essential for all, the many and the few.
In June 91, Microsoft would launch MS-DOS 5, a significant upgrade over previous DOS versions, and the first which allowed you to upgrade your current DOS version. Because of this, Microsoft also chose to do a slightly bigger marketing campaign than they had in the past. At the time, Brad Chase was in charge of the launch. Chase originally joining Microsoft as the product manager for Microsoft Works and Office on the Macintosh. Having gained experience running promotions for Apple, he elected to add a bit of spice to this campaign.
As the word on the screen is, you're out of memory. Oh no! Give me 5.
This was a two-pronged attack.
Okay.
Firstly, visiting user groups to disseminate and explain the
And
new
we're
features,
gonna do
and secondly,
linear
pushing the new upgrade with
apply.
TV advertising, print, and holding a
then
launch
let's
event on a
do
large
this.
boat in New York with Dave
And
Brubeck
it's gonna
performing
be
his song Take
linear
5.
and apply. So now,
This launch worked so well that in some stores people were actually queuing up at midnight the night before launch.
Here's the future. It's no dream. Customers in a steady stream.
But by April 92, Bill Gates knew that PC users needed
Hmm.
more, demanded more in fact. Although they had just released Windows 3.1, it was already lagging behind. Microsoft not only had competition from other platforms, it
okay,
also had competition from its old partner,
keyframe
IBM,
here,
who had just released OS 2 2.0, an operating system
and
Microsoft had actually been
just
helping write
fast
until Windows
forward.
3 took off. But also now an operating system one step ahead of the traditional DOS and Windows combination, featuring a 32-bit API for native programs and the ability to run DOS software. Rather than just providing an environment to run Windows programs, the OS/2 Workplace Shell provided an environment for users to manage programs, files, and devices intuitively. It was marketed by IBM as a
Yeah, this is
better
gonna be
DOS
good.
than DOS and
Gonna
a
go
better
fast,
Windows than
keep
Windows,
praying,
which
we'll
indeed
go
it was.
This linear.
Despite their huge
And
market
this
advantage, Bill Gates
linear.
realized that if Microsoft didn't keep up
And
with the
let's
times,
see this.
then the future
Is
of
this
PC
satisfying
operating systems
animation?
could easily fall into someone else's hands, at a time when the stakes were highest. With this, two projects were initiated. One, codenamed Razzle, and actually based around the OS/2 framework Microsoft had helped develop, would be launched in July 1993 as Windows
Oh, we need
NT
to make
3.1,
this sooner.
offering similar advantages to OS/2
So
and aimed
here.
at high-end professional and server markets. The other was initially coined Win93, designed to be the next significant upgrade for the everyday user and one that needed to beat the balls off everything else, with a penned release date of June 1993. On the 5th of March 1992, an email from Senior Vice President and Project Lead Brad Silverberg stated, "Our mission is to deliver system software for high-volume platforms, i.e. personal systems. This means that major ongoing investments will be for low-end desktops,
Okay.
notebooks, portable machines,
And
pens,
we need
etc.
to go a little bit
Win93 will focus on usability,
faster,
especially the
just so
shell.
we can keep
Ours
up
is rather
with
long in the
myself.
tooth and we know we need improvements. This is our
Yeah, I need
chance
to
to
keep
do
it,
something
keep
cool.
it satisfying.
There are a number of other sub-goals for
Because I need to
Win93,
have it
one of which
in the
is to
middle.
make Windows a lot more functional too. The things today you have to drop down to MS-DOS
Okay, yeah,
to
this one is
accomplish.
good. This one is good.
Everything you can do from DOS should be available from Windows. And this is really key because Microsoft weren't just producers of operating systems, they were producers of software. And within DOS, the likes of Microsoft Office was already in fierce competition with products like Lotus 123 and WordPerfect, big players in the world of business. We'll come back to that later. But by 1994, Windows hadn't really advanced much further other than incremental updates on the existing product. We were now on version 3.11, Windows for Workgroups. Yeah! But things were heating up. This was now a time when PCs weren't just prevalent in America. Even your average UK household would probably have a PC in the corner on one of those desks with a dot matrix or even bubble jet, if you were lucky, printer stowed safely underneath. Plus there was a little thing called the internet that people were just starting to get excited about.
I didn't see this. They didn't tell me about it. Is this new?
This is OS/2 Warp. This isn't what you're used to using.
In that time, IBM had released two significant releases of OS/2, with OS/2 Warp 3 their latest and greatest offering. Whilst Apple were about to launch Mac OS 7.5, introducing the Apple Guide, the control strip,
Still
and
a
various
little bit
methods for
slower.
customizing the desktop. Win93 then was running behind, and that's mainly due to the design changes made along the way. Initially, it was developed to go hand in hand with 32-bit subsystems Project Panther and Cougar, along with Jaguar, essentially DOS 7. But it was felt that the whole concept of a separate command line driven operating system was getting too long in the tooth, and all these projects were bundled under the heading of Project Chicago as a wholly integrated graphical operating system. As the successors of Microsoft MS-DOS, Windows 3.1 and Windows for Workgroups 3.11, Windows Chicago is the next major release of the standard operating system for the desktop and portable PC. There is something for everyone, whether it's a more intuitive way to work, new capabilities like surfing the information highway, or better support for managing a 1000 PC installation site. This is the blurb at the top of the review guide handed out with preview copies of the then named Windows Chicago, along with its main selling points. Chicago makes PCs even easier to use. Chicago is faster and more powerful operating system. Chicago integrates network, connectivity, and manageability. Sounds like some pretty sensible and straightforward improvements, right? So how did we get from this to this? Well, there lies the brilliance of the Microsoft marketing team at this time, who played every angle pretty perfectly. Before this point, Microsoft's strategy for
We
new
still have
products
this,
was silence. Everything was hush-hush. Everything was top secret, which led to speculation, and it led to anticipation, but it didn't lead to many column inches. After all, there was nothing to write home about. It was actually Brad Chase, the marketing lead for Windows 95, who made the call that actually it was time to turn that upside down and tell the world everything they could, in a bid to not just alleviate any fears people had about this weird world of computing, but also to get other companies producing software and accessories, themselves then adding to the hyperbole. Brad had two goals with the marketing campaign. The first was to bring computers into the mainstream, and the second being to make the product a consumer phenomenon. Two goals which were actually perfectly aligned to what the new OS hoped to be. Brad named this strategy the E strategy: educate, excite and engage, for obvious reasons. And as part of his strategy, the other Brad Silverberg, decided to put Chicago through the largest beta test to date, which resulted in 400,000 people taking part. Part of which was the preview program, which cost users $30 to get a sneak peek of the upcoming OS. So in this way, Microsoft not only got paid for most of their bugs to be ironed out, but also the press treadmill began a good year in advance. By September 1994, the press had a name: Windows 95, and the information was flowing. We do want people to move forward, just as we wanted people to move from 3.0 to 3.1, says Brad Struss. Good lord, how many Brads worked in this company? Software was already beginning to label itself Windows 95 ready, and discussions around 32-bit API calls were there to whet the appetites of anyone concerned. And before 1994 was out, there was already a slew of multimedia experiences, videos and books claiming to know the full details of this revolutionary new operating system, most of which focused on the iconic start button to lure people in. After all, this single button would be the gateway to, well, everything, and Microsoft knew that. Most press coverage would concentrate around how much simpler Windows 95 made your PC, along with how much more stable it would be, with lots of talk about how the very limiting and user-unfriendly DOS would be pushed aside entirely. In reality, DOS wasn't discarded, but it was hidden away, designed to run underneath Windows, just like prior versions, but in a fashion where a regular user just wouldn't see or experience it. This was for a number of reasons, including development time, but chiefly it allowed backwards compatibility with a lot of existing DOS and 16-bit software, something they didn't have to worry about on their NT platform. Add to this the new plug-and-play system that meant peripherals could, in theory, just be plugged in and they were good to go, alongside a variety of other improvements, and it felt like 95 would be streets ahead of anything prior, in the world of PCs anyway. In reality, this was the same thing Steve Jobs and Apple had done years prior, but now Microsoft were doing it with the mass market already in situ. Microsoft had initially touted the spring of 95 as the launch window, however this came and went. But the press didn't seem to tire. In fact, they just got more and more hyped about it, thanks in part to the E strategy. Borrowing a little from their DOS 5 launch, Microsoft had dedicated teams working directly to educate, excite and engage business customers, OEM computer manufacturers, third-party developers and the press. But absolutely key was engaging home users. After all, that demand alone would enthuse everyone else. Although DOS 5 had regions where people were queuing from midnight, this needed to be replicated around the world in every major city for it to be a proper success. To aid with this, Microsoft launched a series of promos and collaborations leading up to the launch, including a Windows 95 Sapporo Black Label beer over in Japan. The campaign culminated in a VHS called Microsoft Windows 95 Video Guide. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, this is no news to you, even in 2025. Featuring Matthew Perry alongside Jennifer Aniston and written by Seinfeld contributor Jonathan Gross, this was definitely something to remember, or not, depending on your perspective.
Now, see, that's a coward's laugh.
Nobody calls
Joystick Johnny a coward, ma'am.
With Windows
Okay,
95
okay, I
having been released
think
to
we're going
manufacturing
too
on July
fast.
the 14th, 1995 for English languages, the retail launch date was now set for August the 24th,
We did it
1995,
or
with other
not?
languages following
No,
shortly
no.
after.
Oh,
By this point,
no.
Microsoft had people coming to them asking if they could help promote the product, wanting to be part of this ridiculous hype train. Brad recounts when Don King phoned
Oh,
him up
I
to try and
think
get
I
Windows
that was a
95
mistake,
into
right?
boxing matches.
I got a call from Don King, the boxing promoter.
What did he want?
He wanted to find a way to co-market Windows 95 in boxing matches.
Oh, that's funny.
And if you remember Don King, he has this really distinctive voice. So
Yeah.
Talking on the phone with him was really a out of this world experience.
Along with Steven Spielberg, who wanted to pitch in on the marketing campaign.
I've chosen you to direct our next project, so welcome to the studio.
But it was Doonesbury running a week-long series of comic strips making fun of Windows 95 that really solidified things for Brad.
We did this,
He recounts
we
telling his team that they had
fly.
reached their goals a week before launch because
Okay.
of it.
Then,
and indeed, they had,
let's
because the midnight
play
queues they were
this
hoping for
in,
were
full
absolutely
screen.
rife.
F1. There's our current animation.
2, 1. The cyber hype has been relentless.
Go for it!
It's been worldwide,
There's never been any sale like it ever.
and it's paying off.
Launching around the globe at midnight on the 24th of August 1995, with the initial queues seen in New Zealand copied around the globe.
Is that hot?
I think it has a lot to do with marketing hype. Just want to give it a whack, see what it's all about. Just want to give it a whack, see what it's all about. Just want to give it a whack, see what it's all about.
Those
I
down
think I'm
under
gonna
were
enable the
first to
scoreboard
swarm
just
over
so
Windows
people can actually
95.
see how
But
many
things
blocks
were
I
just
have
getting
placed.
started. As eager punters were already at home, frantically installing their new operating system and potentially working or not, the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington State was gearing up for a launch circus the likes of which the world had never seen. Probably for the best. Now, I feel like this is something we need to work through step by step to really take in the sensational disregard for dignity that was on display here. Details of the event were mostly spread online, which at the time was a pretty impressive feat, but it's no shock to say that 2,000 guests attended, along with 500 members of the press, magazine writers, and various tech celebs of the time, including Lance Ulanoff of PC Magazine, who recalls getting bussed to a campus, weaving through a series of greeting tents before being marched into the presentation pavilion where Bill Gates took the stage. In an article on Medium.com, he reports there being
we're
palpable
now gonna-
excitement that day, which appeared
Yeah,
tailor-made
look at
for
it,
the
look
launch.
at it.
No, I guess at the moment I'm not
Satisfying.
dating much.
My closest ally is the team.
I have to say my husband.
Pandas. Best day is August 25th because it's the day after we ship so I can get married.
After several developer stories, the audience were introduced to the real star of the show, that iconic start button.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of Windows 95.
Before Jay Leno took comedic duties alongside Bill, who talked everyone through the glory of Windows 95.
I'm kind of a computer virgin here, Bill, and as we go through this, I hope you'll be gentle. I hope you'll be kind. All right?
Well, Windows 95 is so easy, even a talk show host can figure it out.
After various questionable jokes, the back of the stage gave way to reveal swathes of developers dressed in Windows logo coloured attire, and that iconic Stones track played for the first
Okay,
time.
yeah.
Started up from their
Let's
1981
do
album
hide,
Tattoo
and
You.
I think the scoreboard is gonna be in the way. Yeah, I think it's gonna be in the way of the pixel UI, so I guess I'm gonna get this into Blender properly and
That
crop
famously
this.
shared and heralded video that even makes Elon Musk look like a
That
normal
is gonna be
member
fine, I
of
think.
society,
Yeah,
featuring
I'm
Steve
just
Ballmer,
gonna
Gates,
render
and
this.
everyone else
So
on
let's
stage,
do
is actually from a different event,
export
although
video,
still linked to the Windows 95 launch. But this was a
finish
huge
1920,
party, filled with the
yes,
entire
okay,
Windows team,
play,
press, third-party developers,
Double
and anyone
resolution,
else
so
who was important enough to get a
4K
goodie bag
is
filled with
maximum.
Windows 95
That's fine.
merchandise and a portable CD player.
MP4 is gonna
Nice.
be good.
You can't just upgrade like that. Well, looks like the upgrade's underway. Bill, we're off and running. Why don't you get one of those moving speeches? That
Yeah, okay, this is gonna be fine. And start export.
Here he is. Good. You do that, and we'll
And
continue
let's
upgrading.
do MegaBase. Wall.
Although the
Or
internet wasn't geared up
two.
for streaming
I think you're not
just
gonna
yet,
see
there was
this.
an online version of this
Uh,
event, so that
Save.
everyone could feel
And now
part
we're
of the
exporting.
hype.
But I don't worry about
However,
why this
events
is
were happening around
stretched.
the world. In New York, the Empire
There's
State
just a
Building was
weird
lit to match the
9x16
Windows logo colours.
resolution being
In Toronto, a 100-meter
stretched.
banner was
Stretched.
draped over the CN Tower. And in
So
the
yeah,
UK,
it's
a launch event at
hard to
London's
read,
Equinox nightclub in
almost,
Leicester Square,
so yeah.
hosted by Jonathan Ross, was attended by a star-studded cast. Fake
Well,
star-studded
we
cast.
actually
I might add, but in fairness, they were
no,
quite good
wait,
lookalikes.
yeah, but actually I think exporting at 4K and
After
then
Gates' 5-minute video
downscaling to
appearance,
1080p.
Ross quipped, "Money can buy
or
you lots of
anti-aliasing.
things, but it does not necessarily buy you a decent haircut." Alongside this absolute festival, giant versions of the Windows 95 logo were painted in fields, probably why aliens stopped making crop circles if they thought that was our response. And Microsoft paid for 1.5 million copies of The Times to be distributed freely, twice its usual distribution number, all with front page press covering the launch. Whilst over in Sydney, Dame Edna Everage unveiled the new OS as one of 20 events.
I'm gonna get
across the
something
country.
That's
in
right.
the
They are
bridge,
singing
guys.
the world will
Wa-
never
watch
be
it
the same
export.
again. Really.
But
Over in
this
Eastern Europe,
looks in
things
real
were a
time,
little
almost
more,
in real time,
well,
I think.
Eastern European, with pirated copies
Yeah,
having
the
been sold for the
scoreboard
past
is
few months,
struggling
and
to
any
keep up.
excitement, well, there was no excitement. But as the reports of Microsoft's
gonna
event
export.
appeared around the globe, so did their new advertising campaign. A campaign that's often used as a yardstick for promotion done right. It was the ad agency Whedon and Kennedy who had come up with the idea, although they elected to leave the negotiation to Brad Chase, who was flown out to meet their promoter, Michael Cole, at the Paradiso in Amsterdam, where the Stones were about to perform 2 unplugged concerts. Despite reports from The Sun that the deal cost Microsoft $14 million, the Stones had originally requested $12 million before a ton of negotiation got it down to a rumoured $3 million, apparently with Jagger unhappy with the deal, but because Richards wanted the money, it was sealed. Which really was great for both sides. It opened the Stones up to various future deals, and it meant that Microsoft didn't have to fall onto their backup advertising plan, which would have made nowhere near the impact that Start Me Up did.
And also just what am I doing? No,
with
like
Whedon and Kennedy,
3
along
years
with Cynthia
later, oh my
Crass,
god, he's such
the
a
head of
dumbass. Why
Windows
did he do
95
that? You know?
working overtime to shoot footage of an entire cross-section of the population to
that's a movie
reflect the
game that
everyday
into
folks
my
they were
hell.
targeting. The core message being that Windows 95 would enable users to do new things and easily handle tasks
the rule of
that were
first
previously difficult.
really
This
helped
combination
me
of good communication,
to
a good
make
product, a good message,
everything
good
in
celebrities,
frame
a
will
good
keep
song,
everything
and
in
importantly, a good budget helped Microsoft achieve the sales they wanted, with 1 million copies of the operating system shipping worldwide in just 4 days. Even IBM buckled,
so even
although they
though
stuck to their guns, insisting on
this
trying
is
to ship
stretch,
OS2 Warp with their new computers. They finally conceded 15
this
minutes
is
before
not
the
actually
95
16 by
launch
9.
event,
It's
signing a
1080 by
contract that would
1920,
allow
so
Windows
it's 9 by
95 to
16
be
and you're
pre-installed
gonna
on their
sit
machines.
on your phone.
However, coming this late to the
So
party
just
badly
seeing that
impacted
everything
their
is in
sales,
frame just
with customers
ensures
choosing
me
to buy
that,
new
yes,
PCs from day one with 95
it's gonna be good.
already
All
installed
good.
from other producers. And Windows 95 achieved dominance really before the launch party was even finished. With an initial rumoured spend of some $300 million, the total marketing spend for Windows 95 would
I hope that
eventually be
this video
estimated
file
at $1
isn't
billion.
gonna be
Not that it
1.2
mattered given the sales
gigabytes.
figures, and by
That's the last one.
1998 Windows 95 had a 57% market share, with their latest product taking 17%, obtaining absolute dominance in a way that only Bill Gates, unimpeded by legalities, could do.
Who? Him? Who? Who? Him? Him? Who?
As Brad Chase stated in a recent podcast, You can't market your way out of a bad product in the software industry, but you can take a great product and make it even more fantastic. So, although we might look back on Windows 95 as being a bit shoddy, a little rough around the edges, which it was, this was all very new, it's fair to say that it wasn't totally bad. It did what it set out to do. It shook up the market, it brought us out of the DOS age, and it actually did make computers, on the whole, a lot easier to use. All the marketing did was turn a good product into a good product that everyone wanted, at a time when computers were really just starting to get exciting. A combination of marketing, timing, and product that educated, excited, and engaged essentially worked.
I wonder how my
You know,
kids
I
have
often
been
find
doing.
it hard to work out whether it was my age, naivety, ignorance, or the fact it was just a simpler time, but I often feel like some of these 90s events, like the launch of Windows 95, felt monumental, like it was going to change the world, like we were getting to that glorious vision of the future faster than ever. And looking back, it just feels calming. Maybe it's just rose-tinted nostalgia, but in reality, Windows 95 did do to computers what later the Wii would do to gaming and what Apple did for mobile phones. And so really, regardless, it was fun, and maybe that's all that matters. For third-party companies, however, it wasn't all rosy.
Now, Microsoft has already upgraded the most popular
1.5
Windows
years,
application,
that's good.
Microsoft Office. As part of our Office preview program, over 200,000 people have started evaluation and begun the move to Office 95. We're really excited that we were able to deliver Windows 95 and Office 95 together, so they're available for customers today.
Okay, export
Remember
has
that Microsoft
finished.
was struggling with competition to their business
Let's see
products?
if it's
Well,
true.
by moving
I'm
everyone
gonna share
across
my
to a new
screen,
Windows
which
platform,
is not
it kind
really
of
good
killed the
and
DOS-based
recommended.
competition, and then businesses upgraded to new Office suites that Microsoft had already developed
I'm
before
gonna do
launch day,
this,
and designed to
minimize.
make the most of their new environment.
Okay.
This was not only the case with the Office suite, but by having the Microsoft network
Wait.
ready to go on every copy of Windows, it also dealt a
Let's
massive blow to
do-
internet
Wait,
providers.
I
who had to
already
resort
have
to
display
cover discs
capture.
and huge promotions to get users to
Okay.
install their internet connection suites on top of the new operating system. In the build-up to
So
the
we
launch and the
should
days
be
preceding it,
this
was
world,
increasingly
MegaBase
an
Explorer,
issue,
MegaBase
with
Explorer
competitors
2.
all jumping on their boxes to complain. Something that Microsoft would kind of pay for at a later date, although by this point, it didn't really matter.
Yeah.
Microsoft had
Okay,
both
okay,
had
this
line
video
here,
is
not
fine.
just achieving
Yep.
incredible
It was
sales,
just
but by
it
ensuring
is
their
okay.
future through all the software which ran on top. Remember that video of Bill Gates jumping the chair?
Is it true that you can leap over a chair from a standing position?
It depends on the size of the chair. I'll cheat a little bit.
I'll cheat a little bit. Yeah, turns out that's really his business approach too. Which, you know, fair play to the man. He not only jumped the chair, but he jumped everyone else too. Until next time, I've been Nostalgia Nerd.
Yeah.
Toodaloo!
Yeah, this works okay. We're gonna upload it to TikTok. Okay. So TikTok.
If you were a computer user back in the mid-90s, chances are you were using Windows, because let's be honest, there was really no contest in regards to what the most widely used operating system was. Windows 95 absolutely flew off the shelves when it was released, and by 1996, Microsoft controlled over 80% of desktop computer market share. And if you weren't a part of that percentage, then chances are you were probably a Mac user, the next largest piece of the pie. Or maybe you were a believer in OS 2, the short-lived collab between Microsoft and IBM that ended in a bitter divorce and the ultimate downfall of what was a pretty promising piece of software. But this video is not about OS 2, Windows, or Mac OS, and it's certainly not about Linux. Yeah, I didn't forget to mention Linux, though I'm sure I'll still get comments about it anyway. Today we're going to be talking about BOS, the largely forgotten operating system from the 1990s. Sponsored by Linode, cloud computing from Akamai. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. So for the uninitiated, BOS was an operating system developed by the appropriately named B Incorporated and first released in 1995. The company itself was founded by Jean-Louis Gasset, whose name may sound familiar if you're into vintage Mac stuff, because he used to be an executive at Apple until around 1990. And BOS was designed to be vastly different when compared to Windows and Mac OS, while at the same time being similar enough to make switching to the operating system pretty straightforward. What set BOS apart was its major focus on multimedia. The company dubbed it the Media OS in the BOS white paper, where they made a case for a new operating system that was built from the ground up to utilize newer hardware features for digital multimedia, arguing that then modern versions of Windows and Mac OS were built on top of older systems that weren't designed for this type of work, saying that Windows 95 has its roots in DOS, Windows NT in the VAX systems originally designed by DEC, Mac OS in the early ideas of Xerox PARC, and Mach in the labs of Carnegie Mellon, both designed in the late 1970s. So BOS was its own thing. This wasn't a Linux distro, and it wasn't based on any other operating system that already existed, though it is considered by many to be Unix-like. And the cool thing was, both Intel and PowerPC-based systems could run this thing, though it was initially only compiled for PowerPC because that's what B based their own hardware around. Yeah, they were a hardware company too, and they produced a really short-lived line of computers known as B boxes, but these were aimed at industry professionals instead of average consumers. And that, combined with the ultimate failure of BOS as a whole to grab onto a sizable portion of market share, means that these things are extremely difficult to find. But B did try to get their OS bundled with machines from other manufacturers, and they were successful in that, as eventually BOS came bundled with machines from Power Computing and Motorola, who were some of the few companies that had Apple's blessing to produce Mac clones in the 90s. Though it didn't come pre-installed, these were still Mac clones first and foremost, so they ran Mac OS. But users got a BOS disk in the box that they could install on their machine to dual boot with Mac OS, or just wipe the drive and have it as the sole operating system if they so desired. And while this was certainly great for B, it didn't really make much of a difference in terms of increasing BOS's market share, because this was an optional thing that the user had to go out of their way to install, and even if every single user did that, the authorized Mac clone program only lasted for about a year or so before it was killed off. So B knew that if they wanted to have a chance at capturing a significant portion of OS market share, they were going to have to target the largest portion of that market share, of course being Wintel machines. And by 1998, BOS had been ported to x86, but as you can probably expect, the company had a difficult time getting their OS pre-installed on OEM computers. The downfall of BOS could probably have been predicted at a time when Windows was pretty much too big to fail. In fact, and maybe not surprisingly, B accused Microsoft of threatening PC OEMs with higher Windows licensing costs to prevent them from pre-installing BOS on their computers. And I don't mean pre-installed as the only OS, I mean dual-booted with Windows. And this is where B was incredibly smart. They knew that due to Windows' extremely high market share, no OEM in their right mind was going to replace it with another OS on their computers, even if they weren't going to get a friendly visit from Microsoft after doing so. Instead, B took the approach of coexisting with Windows. OEMs could get a BOS license and pre-install it on their computers alongside Windows. This way, the massive selection of software and games written for Windows could still run on these computers out of the box, and at the same time, users could easily experience BOS's multimedia capabilities and perhaps even decide to use it as their primary OS of choice. And to entice OEMs to do this, B did not charge them anything to get a BOS license to pre-install on their computers. It was an excellent strategy to increase B's market share, and I think if it actually had worked, it would have certainly made up for the lost royalties that B missed out on. But that didn't happen, and I'm sure you saw that coming, because even though B was in talks with a handful of OEMs, not a single one of them agreed to pre-install BOS on their computers, with the notable exception of Hitachi. They put out a press release in November of 1998 announcing the Flora Prius 330J line of machines that would come dual-booted with Windows and BOS. This was accomplished through two ways. The first was a boot manager that would display upon booting up the system, where the user could choose whatever operating system they want to boot into, and the second was an icon placed on the Windows desktop that the user could double-click to easily reboot the system into BOS, none of which made Microsoft very happy. And according to a lawsuit that B filed against them, right after Microsoft flew a couple of representatives to Hitachi's headquarters in Japan to remind them of the Windows licensing terms, Hitachi told B that they weren't able to ship machines with a boot manager that allowed booting into another OS besides Windows. And this is a story that I'm sure you've heard many times before, because multiple companies accused Microsoft of doing the same thing back in the 90s, which I don't doubt at all. But what's interesting about this case is that Hitachi actually ended up shipping these computers with both Windows and BOS pre-installed. They just removed the custom bootloader. So there was a BOS partition on the hard drive, you just couldn't boot into it unless you had a BOS boot floppy. So for all intents and purposes, these things were Windows boxes, and unless the user went through a tedious process outlined by B on their website to install the boot manager yourself, they were going to stay that way. All of this means that B was technically able to get their OS pre-installed on a...
Let's pause. That is change when the camera rotates.